Hello, my name's Alison Kenney and I used to work for many years as an archivist at the City of Westminster Archive Centre. And this is Matthew Houlihan, who's an actor, who's going to join me this afternoon as we take a look at some fascinating documents from the Archive Centre on the subject of the Poor Law, and in particular the life of the paupers who were put into the workhouse. And we've got a marvellous poem called Christmas Day in the Workhouse to have a look at with you. Well, Matthew, here we are in December already and looking forward to our traditional Christmas dinner. But I think it's a good point to stop and think about what it was like for poor people in the past, those living on the breadline. And we've got a very poignant poem called Christmas Day in the Workhouse, written in 1903 by George Robert Sims.
Now what do we know about him?
Well, we do know quite a lot about him, actually. He was a prolific journalist, poet and playwright who became a great social reformer. And his life was in the late Victorian and early Edwardian period. And he used his writing skills to great effect to highlight the plight of the poor, such as the pauper talked about in this particular poem.
What were workhouses exactly? I mean, when did they start? What were they built for?
Well, there is a surviving workhouse in Southwell in Nottinghamshire, and it's owned by the National Trust now and used as a good example of this type of building. I haven't been there myself, but I have seen it on the television, and it shows just how grim these places were. You see, in the Middle Ages, if you were poor, you would go to your nearest monastery to receive alms, spelled ALMS, which was often a loaf of bread doled out to you through the sort of dole gate by the monks. Well, after Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in 1536, there was really nobody to look after the poor, and there was a huge problem in the middle of the 16th century with vagrancy. So the poor law system was set up under Elizabeth I to make parishes responsible for the upkeep of the poor. And they did this by levying rates on the householders to pay for the outgoings on sort of board and lodging and clothes for the paupers. If people already had a little bit of wages and they just needed a top-up payment, they were given what's called outdoor relief, a bit like the benefits system today. However, if they were completely destitute, they could be fed and housed in the workhouse in a system called indoor relief, but they would have to produce goods in return for the board and lodging they were given, and the goods could be sold by the parish to raise money to offset the upkeep.
Well, when did the poor law end?
You might be surprised by the answer, but it only ended finally in 1929. There'd been various changes to the Poor Law during the 19th century, particularly the Poor Law Amendment Act in 1834. And this specified that instead of the parish officials, it would be boards of guardians who were elected to take over the administration of the poor relief in that area. And some of the larger London parishes did set up their own board of guardians at that point. However, the smaller parishes tended to join together into unions, and then the union would have the elected board of guardians. So some parishes, Westminster parishes, put the Act into effect straight away in 1834. Other parishes just sort of kept on going with the parish officials dealing with poor relief until there was a bit of a roundup of legislation, and there was the Metropolitan Poor Law Act in 1867, which brought in boards of guardians for all areas.
Wow. Shall we take a look at the poem to see what it tells us about?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, let's have a look at it here. It is Christmas Day in the workhouse, and the cold bare walls are bright, with garlands of green and holly, and the place is a pleasant sight. For with clean washed hands and faces, in a long and hungry line, the paupers sit at the table, for this is the hour they dine. And the guardians and their ladies, although the wind is east, have come in their furs and wrappers to watch their charges feast, to smile and be condescending, put pudding on pauper plates, to be hosts at the workhouse banquet they've paid for with the rates. Oh, the paupers are meek and lowly with their thank ye kindly mums, so long as they fill their stomachs, what matter it whence it comes? But one of the old men mutters and pushes his plate aside.
Great God,
he cries,
but it chokes me.
for this is the day she died."
The guardians gazed in horror. The master's face went white. Did a pauper refuse the pudding? Could their ears believe aright? Then the ladies clutched their husbands, thinking the man would die, struck by a bolt or something, by the outraged one on high. But the pauper sat for a moment, then rose mid silence grim, for the others had ceased to chatter and trembled in every limb. He looked at the guardians' ladies, then eyeing their lords, he said,
"I eat not the food of villains, whose hands are foul and red, whose victims cry for vengeance from their dark unhallowed graves."
"He's drunk," said the workhouse master, "or else he's mad and raves."
"Not drunk or mad,"
cried the pauper,
"but only a haunted beast, who, torn by the hounds and mangled, declines the vulture's feast. I care not a curse for the guardians, and I won't be dragged away. Just let me have the fit out. It's only on Christmas Day that the black past comes to goad me and prey on my burning brain. I'll tell you the rest in a whisper. I swear I won't shout again. Keep your hands off me, curse you! Hear me out to the end. You come here to see how paupers the season of Christmas spend. You come here to watch us feeding, as they watched the captured beast. Here's why a penniless pauper spits on your paltry feast. Do you think I will take your bounty and let you smile and think you're doing a noble action with your parish's meat and drink? Where is my wife, you traitors? The poor old wife you slew. Yes, by the God above me, my Nance was killed by you. Last winter my wife lay dying, starved in a filthy den. I had never been to the parish. I came to the parish then. I swallowed my pride in coming, for ere the ruin came, I held up my head as a trader, and I bore a spotless name. I came to the parish craving bread for a starving wife, bread for the woman who loved me through 50 years of life. And what do you think they told me, mocking my awful grief? That the house was open to us, but they wouldn't give out relief. I slunk to the filthy alley. 'Twas a cold, raw Christmas Eve, and the bakers' shops were open, tempting a man to thieve. But I clenched my fists together, holding my head awry. So I came to her empty-handed, and mournfully told her why. Then I told her the house was open. She had heard of the ways of that, for her bloodless cheeks went crimson, and up in her rags she sat, crying, "Bide the Christmas here, John. We've never had one apart. I think I can bear the hunger. The other would break my heart." All through that eve I watched her, holding her hand in mine, praying the Lord and weeping, till my lips were salt as brine. I asked her once if she hungered, and as she answered no, the moon shone in at the window, set in a wreath of snow. Then the room was bathed in glory, and I saw in my darling's eyes the faraway look of wonder that comes when the spirit flies. And her lips were parched and parted, and her reason came and went, for she raved of our home in Devon, where our happiest years were spent. And the accents, long forgotten, came back to the tongue once more, for she talked like the country lassie I wooed by the Devon shore. Then she rose to her feet and trembled, and fell on the rags and moaned, and "Give me a crust, I'm famished, for the love of God," she groaned. I rushed from the room like a madman, and flew to the workhouse gate, crying, "Food for a dying woman!" And the answer came, too late. They drove me away with curses. Then I fought with a dog in the street, and tore from the mongrel's clutches a crust he was trying to eat. Back through the filthy byways, back through the trampled slush, up to the crazy garret, wrapped in an awful hush. My heart sank down at the threshold, and I paused with a sudden thrill, for there, in the silvery moonlight, my Nance lay, cold and still. Up to the blackened ceiling the sunken eyes were cast. I knew on those lips, all bloodless, my name had been the last. She called for her absent husband. Oh God, had I but known, had called in vain and in anguish, had died in that den alone. Yes, there, in a land of plenty, lay a loving woman dead, cruelly starved and murdered for a loaf of the parish bread. At yonder gate last Christmas I craved for a human life, you who would feed us paupers. What of my murdered wife? There, get ye gone to your dinners, don't mind me in the least. Think of the happy paupers eating your Christmas feast. And when you recount their blessings in your smug parochial way, say what you did for me too, only last Christmas Day.
That was a very powerful poem, wasn't it? Incredibly poignant, and you can really identify with the pauper and what he went through there. And I would imagine that the poem had a tremendous impact on social reform at the time.
I would hope so.
This picture shows rows of pauper men having dinner in the vast dining hall at the St Marylebone Workhouse, which was situated on the south side of Marylebone Road, just where the University of Westminster campus is now. It was a huge complex of very forbidding-looking Victorian institutional buildings, which were probably quite advanced for their day, but they were certainly designed to strike fear into the hearts of any poor people approaching the gate, seeking a roof over their heads and food on the table in exchange for their hard labour. They would have been picking oakum or breaking stones, a bit like life in a prison.
Oh. Why would people go there if the conditions were so harsh?
Well, it was the only place left for people to go if they were destitute. But the parishes and later poor law unions certainly weren't giving anything away for nothing. So the paupers were made to work hard, making things which the parish could sell in return for their board and lodging, or indoor relief as it was called. Basically, it's that age-old question of the deserving and the undeserving poor, which is still with us today.
Yes, it goes to show that it's a very Dickensian conversation.
Yeah, indeed, yes, it was. And of course, the workhouse infirmary was often the only place where poor people could receive any medical treatment. And funnily enough, some Victorian workhouse buildings remain today as part of NHS hospitals.
Wow. Do we know where this particular picture of this workhouse was taken?
Yes, we do actually. It comes from George R. Sims's publication Living London. We've met Sims already. He was the author of the Christmas Day in the Workhouse poem that we've just read through. And he exposes the harsh treatment of the poor by the authorities, who of course were largely middle class. Sims was a journalist, a poet and playwright who turned his talents to the cause of social reform, and he published Living London in 1901 to 1903. And actually it contains a chapter called In a London Workhouse, which is where this particular picture of the workhouse at St Marylebone was taken from.
The paupers here look very regimented in row after row here.
Yes, they do.
Eating what looks like bowls of gruel or some vegetables.
Yes.
Do you think this picture is accurate, or is it slightly inauthentic? Is it an actual photograph, or it looks touched up in some way?
Yes, well, that's a very good question, Matthew, actually, and one which occurred to me when I first saw it years ago, when I was preparing an exhibition on workhouses. I certainly think that paupers would have been regimented, but it does look as if it's been sort of had the Victorian equivalent of photoshopping done to it. Now, how possible that would have been, I don't know. I'd have to ask a historian of the sort of photography and the techniques. Yeah. But incidentally, yes, you notice the vegetables there. Incidentally, paupers were given extra rations of beef on Christmas Day. Here we're looking at an Ordnance Survey map dating from 1871 of the workhouse of St Martin-in-the-Fields. just north of Trafalgar Square. And remember me telling you I appeared on Who Do You Think You Are, the very popular BBC programme which goes into the family history of celebrities. And of course my celebrity was that great character actor Brian Blessed, whose ancestor came up from Portsmouth to London at the age of 6 with his elder brother, who was 8, who had to act as the spokesperson for the family, because the elder sister, who was 14, had a mental disability, what we would call learning difficulties these days. And the children had been orphaned, and they were sent up on a coach on their own to London, to the parish of St Martin-in-the-Fields, because their late father was born there and had a legal right of settlement under the Poor Law Acts. And he moved south to work as a printer to the Navy in Portsmouth. But at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1816, his work had dried up, and it sounds as if he died a broken man. And sadly, his wife and the mother of the children also died of an illness there. So they were orphaned.
So what happened to Brian's family once they moved to St Martin-in-the-Fields?
Well, they turned up at the workhouse, which, as we can see, was on Hemmings Row in the corner of Castle Street and Hemmings Row, which is actually the site of the National Portrait Gallery now.
Right, yeah.
And they were interviewed by the parish officials to see if they were legally entitled to poor relief from the parish. And as I said, it was the 8-year-old boy that had to act as family spokesperson. And what happened was he and Brian's ancestor, who was 6, plus the eldest girl of 14 with the learning difficulties, and the youngest, who was a girl of only 2, they were split up. And the 8-year-old was apprenticed to a shoemaker in Lambeth so that he could learn a trade and become self-supporting after the apprenticeship of 7 years had expired. Now, Brian's ancestor, who as we know was 6, he was packed off to an infant poor establishment in North London, somewhere up near Hendon. And he was absolutely miserable there, and he kept running away. To meet up, I think, with his elder brother in London. He just kept running away. And the 2 girls, the 14-year-old and the 2-year-old, they died within months of entering the workhouse, obviously of some disease. But eventually, Brian said his ancestor became a sea captain up in Newcastle on Tyne. And interestingly, there's a record of him meeting his elder brother when they were both middle-aged.
Wow.
So what had started as a very sad story actually had quite a happy ending in the end.
That's beautiful. And what does this particular map tell us about the St Martin's Workhouse itself?
Well, if we look at it, first of all, we can see that it was built on the site of the old parish burial ground, which is opposite to St Martin-in-the-Fields Church. But also, most importantly, it shows very strict segregation between men and women. We've got women's dining hall, women's workroom, then there's a men's workroom, a men's ward. So very strict segregation between men and women, basically because the parish authorities didn't want any more pauper children being born in the workhouse and becoming chargeable to the Poor Law Union. Well, here is a very curious drawing from the Illustrated London News in 1863, which is a great personal interest to me. Can you read what it says on the caption?
Members of the United Cooks Society preparing a monster plum pudding at Marylebone Workhouse for the Lancashire operatives. And would this kitchen have been the same one that fed the workhouse people that we saw in the previous picture?
Yes, it would. It's the very same one for that picture that we were looking at earlier.
And what was going on in 1863 for this monster pudding to have been baked and sent to Lancashire? And why is this of interest to us?
Well, I come from Manchester originally.
Oh.
And my ancestors on my father's side of the family were cotton mill workers. So what was happening up north at the time was that the supply of cotton from North America had dried up because of the American Civil War between the northern and southern states. And the latter were known as Confederates. That's where the cotton came from. So the cotton plantations in the deep south were worked by African slaves. And this was one of the things that Abraham Lincoln was keen to stop and modernise. So interestingly, the Lancashire cotton mill workers were very supportive of the slaves and the abolitionist cause.
Do we know any more about the circumstances of these Lancashire mill workers?
Well, yes, we do. Actually, there's an article that accompanies the picture in the Illustrated London News, and it's called The Distress in the North. And it says that there was a meeting at Manchester Town Hall, chaired by Sir J.K. Shuttleworth.
Oh, a great northern name.
Yes, it is. And it talks about the number of cotton mill workers receiving poor relief in Ashton-under-Lyne, Stockport and Oldham, which are all just up the road from where I come from. And a special relief fund was set up to help the mill workers, and it's fascinating to read who donated to it. There was the Pope, no less.
The Pope?
Yes, the Pope. And British residents in New York who'd sent over a consignment of bacon via Cunard ships. Plus, we have the London United Cooks Pension Society who sent this monster plum pudding, which apparently measured 3 feet 3 inches by 3 feet 2 inches. Interesting. It contained currants, sultanas, peel, mixed spice, ginger, flour and sugar, obviously, 8 gallons of ale, and guess how many eggs? 1,040 eggs. Just imagine that.
That is a monster.
Yes, it weighed 900 pounds. And it had its own special escort of volunteers to take it from the St Marylebone Workhouse to the City of London. Of course, from there, it was sent up to Manchester to be distributed on New Year's Day. Right, well, I hope you've enjoyed joining us for this look at the life of poor people in Victorian and Edwardian Westminster. In particular, I mean, the poem called A Christmas Day in the Workhouse is tremendously powerful, and I just hope it had a great impact at the time. Obviously, it was a move towards the end of the Poor Law in 1929. Many of the institutional buildings did carry on, and they were used as hospitals or they were used as old people's homes, which is why a lot of people of my grandmother's generation would beg not to be sent to the workhouse when they were possibly in need of care in their old age. It was a great terror that still hung over people at the time. And then obviously we've ended up with the amazing monster plum pudding that was sent up, possibly distributed to my own ancestors. So if you've enjoyed looking at these items with us, there are plenty more Poor Law records at the City of Westminster Archive Centre. It's situated at number 10 St Anne's Street, which is about 5 minutes walk from Westminster Abbey. The postcode is SW1P2DE. It's also a short walk from St James's Park Tube Station. The opening hours are Tuesday to Saturday, opening at 10 o'clock in the morning, and on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays, the Archive Centre closes at 7 o'clock in the evening. On Fridays and Saturdays, it opens also at 10 o'clock in the morning, but closes at 5 o'clock in the evening. And it is closed on Mondays and also Sundays. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, we have been asking people to telephone in advance or email to book an appointment. And the telephone number is 0207 641 5180. And you can find the other contact details and all the visitor information on the website at www.westminster.gov.uk and /archives with the S on the end. Well, we wish you a Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a considerably better one than the pauper in the poem of A Christmas Day in the Workhouse. Thank you very much for watching our film. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope to see you soon at the Archive Centre. Goodbye.